Unit 1 is comprised of chapters 1, 4, and 6, with chapter 1 being sort of an introduction to science and how we do science. In chapter 4 and 6, we really get into the biology that we're going to be studying this semester. So chapter 4 is all about cells. Cells are the smallest unit that are considered to be living and functional as individual entities. And then chapter 6, we're going to talk about DNA, which is our genetic material within our cell. So we're going to talk a little bit about what life is. That was actually covered in chapter 1, but I feel like it sort of fits better here in chapter 2. And we're going to define a cell, and we're going to talk about the structure and functions of the different components of a cell. We are also going to talk a little bit about how cells communicate with each other, because whether they are single-celled organisms or part of a multi-celled organism, cells have to interact with the environment around them. So let's begin by asking what biology actually is. So biology is the study of life. I'm quite confident that you all know that already. But what is life? How do we actually define it? Now, there are lots of different ways you can define this. You can define this as a at a personal level, at a belief system level. We are in biology, so we are going to define it as biologists define it. So there are a few important themes or characteristics of living organisms. These are characteristics that all living organisms share. Obviously, there are other characteristics that some organisms share, and so there are many other things that sort of go into our definition of what is life. But I'm going to give you some of those, the biological definition of life, and then I'm just going to really briefly talk about a couple of important themes in the study of biology and some of the important topics in biology. So I want you to take a second. I'm not actually going to pause for a second, but you might pause for a second and think about the things that you would say are characteristics of all living organisms, and just sort of see how it compares to the definition that our book uses for living organisms. So some of the characteristics that are shared by all living organisms, they are complex, or they have a complex and ordered organization. So we don't go into it too much in here, but in Biology 101, we talk about molecules being organized into larger molecules, and we see those molecules being ordered into the different parts of the cell and ordered in a very particular manner for a very particular function. And then those organs or organelles within the cell work together to make a living cell, a functioning cell. And then if we continue on to multi-celled organisms, we have a bunch of different cells with different jobs all functioning together. And this sort of ordered, consistent organization of life becomes really apparent. If we go past organelles and we think cell types and we start thinking about the human body, we have cells in our body, and they're organized into tissues, and then into organs, and then into limbs and different parts of our body. And then we are organized as a group into this, the whole earth around us. So biology is just sort of this really complex, super organized set of living systems. All living organisms have to utilize energy. So we take in food, it's converted into energy. It might be stored as fat. We might use it for different purposes in our body, but all living organisms have to take in energy from their environment somehow. Plants do that differently than animals, and some bacteria do that differently than animals as well. And then they have to transform that energy. They have to convert it into something that's usable for the cell. All living organisms are sensitive to and interact with their external environment. So you are not an isolated individual within our world. You're constantly interacting with people and animals and plants, and even the non-living or the abiotic parts of our environment. The chair you're sitting in, you're uncomfortable, so you shuffle and move, or you move your chair because the sun's in your eyes. All living organisms are interacting with their environment in some way. All living organisms regulate their body or their internal environment. So if you're a single-celled organism, you still have to regulate the systems within your bodies and or within yourself. You're a single-celled organism, you don't have a body, but you have to regulate your internal environment, and you have to maintain a certain level of regulation. This is called homeostasis. It's basically keeping a consistent status in your body. So we regulate our temperature, we regulate the pH of our blood, all kinds of things our body regulates day in and day out. All living organisms grow, develop, and reproduce. So the whole point of life, I think some biologists would argue, is reproduction. So organisms are born, they grow, they develop, and then they pass on their genes. And if you're thinking strictly from an evolutionary and biological standpoint, the whole point is to pass on your genes to the next generation. And then finally, all living organisms will adapt to their environment. They will interact with it and they will adapt to it. But at a larger level, at the species level, species adapt to their environment and they change over time. So evolution of organisms or populations of organisms is a really important theme as well, and that is something that is shared by all living organisms. They as a group, a particular species will respond to their environment. So that hierarchical organization and evolution are two major themes in biology. And they sort of govern the way that organisms function, the way they function in their environment, and the way that they can change and adapt to the world around them. So biology generally has four major areas of focus, and we're going to touch on each of these just a little bit, some of it more in depth than others. So we've got chemical, cellular, and energetic foundation. So these are this is basically the chemistry of life, how organisms are built, how the processes within their bodies work, and how they take in and transform energy. Then we've got genetics, evolution, and behavior. So these are the ways that organisms pass on their information, the way that they are able then to change over time to interact with other organisms. And then we've also got diversity and unity of life. So we've got this vast a variety of organisms on our planet, sometimes mind-blowingly vast when you think about all of the different types of organisms. And there are many, many more that we don't know. But evolution as a theme is able to explain that diversity and able to unite all living organisms back to a common ancestor. And then we have ecology, the study of the environment and the way that organisms interact and inhabit the world around them. So just sort of keep these themes in mind and these areas as we're going through, and just sort of think about, as we're talking about the cell, how the cells are organized and how that organization allows them to interact with their environment or other cells within a multicellular organism, and how over time evolution has actually shaped cells into what we see today. So let's go back to the most basic unit. All living organisms are made of cells. They might be made of one cell, they might be made of a lot of cells. You are probably most familiar with multicellular organisms, animals, dogs, cats, plants, mushrooms, bugs, things like that. Those are all multicellular organisms. But they are all built up of individual cells, and individual cells are the smallest unit of life that can function independently. That doesn't mean that every cell does function independently, but every cell is theoretically capable of functioning independently from all other cells, and all cells can perform the necessary functions of life, including reproducing themselves. So when I ask you what the smallest unit of life is, the answer is the cell. We're going to talk about parts of the cells. We're going to talk about briefly some of the molecules, the types of molecules that are important in a cell. And although some of the parts of the cells do particular things, they cannot live outside the cell. And that's what makes the cell the smallest unit of life. So where do cells come from? They have to come from somewhere, right? Everything has to come from somewhere. And so the cell theory it proposes the origin of the cell. So remember in chapter 1, we talked about theories, and theories are basically hypotheses that continue to be supported over and over again. And they begin to be thought of as biological fact. Now remember, a theory could be disproven at any point, but in general, once something makes it to the level of a biological theory, it's supported by so much information that it's going to be hard to refute it. There's got to be some very compelling evidence to the contrary. So we are, for this class, going to accept the cell theory as the explanation for the origin of cells. And so cell theory is really important in biology, and it is something that is universally accepted. There are two important tenets to the cell theory. One is that all living organisms are made up of one or more cells. So this means that some organisms might be single-celled, some organisms might be multicellular. The pictures we have on the left there, a human, a plant, a mushroom, those are all multicellular organisms. So they're made up of sort of a community of cells. But we can have single-celled organisms, and they can function perfectly on their own at the smallest level that we accept as living. The second part of the cell theory is that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. So if you remember, we talked about germ theory in chapter 1, and we talked about Louis Pasteur and how he did that swan neck experiment where he heated up that flask with the swan neck, killed anything that was living inside, and then showed that nothing could grow from that. But if you exposed it to the air, he theorized that cells or living organisms could get in, and that's why you got life. And so that is some of the support for the cell theory, that if there is nothing, you don't get cells. Cells don't come from nothing. Cells have to come from somewhere else, and they come from pre-existing cells. And we'll actually talk about in a few chapters the process of how this occurs, how one cell gives rise to another, or how cells reproduce. Now, the one exception to the cell theory, of course, is the first cell. So that first cell would have come out of nothing. I say nothing with quotes. I know you can't see my air quotes here, but cells didn't really come out of nothing. They came out of the components of cells coming together to build a functioning cell. So very important, cell theory states that all living organisms are made up of at least one cell, and that all cells arise from other pre-existing cells. Now that second one is really important for the process of evolution, because when those cells divide, they copy and pass on their genetic information. And so during this reproduction, you get sort of this continuity of information from one cell to the next generation. So I mentioned the first cells. The first cells on Earth likely originated from free-floating molecules in the ocean very, very early on in Earth's history. The estimated time is about 3.5 billion years ago. And since that time, all cells and all life have produced a continuous line of cells. So there's our cells arise from pre-existing cells. Now, those cells may have changed over time, and they have diversified into this huge variety of organisms on Earth. And we'll talk about that once we get into how cells actually pass on their information, and then how that information changes so much that we get this huge diversity. But here we also see that theme of unity and diversity. All living organisms can be traced back to this the single cell, and because of that we have this sort of continuity of information and relatedness of all living organisms. But also through the process of evolution, those cells have diversified over time. And so we get the second half of that theme, which is the diversity of living organisms. Great, so let's talk about eggs. Eggs are essentially the largest single cell. Normally you can't see a single cell. You can't see all of the billions and trillions of cells that make up your body. You can't see an individual one. You need a microscope for that. In our upcoming labs, we will actually look at cells under the microscope, but you actually can see some individual cells. Now there's some debate as to whether an egg, such as an ostrich egg or a chicken egg, is actually a single cell. An unfertilized one is sort of a single cell with all of the nutrients surrounding it. So you're sort of seeing the structure around the cell. Human eggs are quite large, actually. There's a picture of one down there on the bottom. And they are actually quite large cells. So they are one of the largest single cells. And then of course on top we have caviar or fish eggs. And those are also individual cells. So most of the cells that we're going to be talking about are actually not these large, exciting cells that you're familiar with. But we are going to talk about the characteristics that unite all cells, and then the characteristics that unite eukaryotic cells. So every cell on Earth falls into one of two categories. We have a eukaryotic cell that is characterized by a structure called a nucleus. Now, a eukaryotic cell is the type of cell that's going to make up our multicellular organisms. There are some organisms that are eukaryotes that have their nucleus and that actually exist as single-cell organisms. But most of the eukaryotic cells are actually part of a multicellular organism. That nucleus that characterizes the eukaryotic cell contains DNA, which is our genetic information, our molecule that houses all of the genetic information within our cell. And then we have the prokaryotic cell. So the prokaryotes are the organisms that exist as single-celled organisms. Prokaryotic cells are defined by the lack of a nucleus. So while that is the defining characteristic of the eukaryote, the lack of one is the defining characteristic of a prokaryote. Now, prokaryotic cells still have DNA because that's our molecule of heredity. That's the molecule that contains the information for how cells and organisms function. It just isn't enclosed in a little package called the nucleus. So prokaryotic cells are very simple compared to eukaryotic cells, and they produce these very simple organisms. They are considered very simple because they lack some of the structural diversity that eukaryotes have, but the sheer number and type of prokaryotes is incredible. They occupy a huge variety of environments on Earth, and there are a huge number of known species and vastly more unknown species. So prokaryotic cells are very, very diverse, and they really shouldn't be thought of as primitive because they have sort of evolved into being able to deal with basically any environment on Earth. So prokaryotes are single-celled organisms. They include two major groups, the bacteria and archaea groups. And these guys, between those two groups, have tremendous metabolic diversity. This means that they can function in a wide variety of environments and use a wide variety of energy sources. So as I said, prokaryotes have no nucleus. And they are also, we said they were also very simple. They were actually the first type of cell on Earth. we'll talk about in later chapters evolution and diversity of life and how they change. But basically, prokaryotic cells developed from sort of free-floating molecules that came together in a highly organized and functioning way that allowed this idea that we call life. So let's talk about some of the structural features of a prokaryote. So there are 4 structures in all prokaryotes, and really in all cells. And then there are some other structures listed. We'll talk about what those are, but these 4 structures, the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes, are found in all cells, not just prokaryotes. And they are critical in defining something as a cell. So the plasma membrane is the structure that encloses the cell. So here it is shown in green around the edge of the cell, and we'll talk about what that outer coating is in just a few minutes. Anything inside the plasma membrane is referred to as intercellular, so inside the cell, while everything outside is called extra, or outside the cell, extracellular. So that plasma membrane is important because it isolates the cell contents from the rest of the environment. Now all cells, eukaryotes and prokaryotes, have a plasma membrane, and they interact with the environment. They regulate the movement of things in and out. Inside the cell, you'll find the cytoplasm. This is kind of a jelly-like fluid. It sort of gives the cell structure, and it's basically a filling. It supports the components of the cell, it supports the plasma membrane, and gives it a 3D-like structure. Prokaryotes contain genetic information in the form of DNA, just like all cells. They are, in a prokaryote, they are circular loops. So this big loop is the genomic DNA of the bacteria. So this contains the majority of the genetic information. Now this is going to code for how to produce the plasma membrane. It's going to code for producing different proteins that are sort of the worker bees of the cell, do different functions in the cell, and really just encode all the instructions for living and functioning in a particular environment. Prokaryotes also have this small piece of DNA called plasmids. Now these are small plasmids that are not necessarily required for life, but they usually offer some sort of benefit. So antibiotic resistance, or the ability to use a specific food source, and those plasmids can be exchanged between prokaryotes. And then we have ribosomes. So ribosomes are really important because the ribosome is the structure that takes the genetic information and turns it into proteins. Now proteins are the molecules within the cell that perform cellular function. So the ribosome is basically a workbench for building proteins. And so the ribosome is really important in converting that genetic information in the cell into sort of a usable workforce. So prokaryotes, depending on what they are, they usually also have a cell wall. They don't have to, but most of them do because they are individual organisms. So I actually misspoke a second ago. There are actually 2 green layers. I should have said that inner green layer there is the plasma membrane. The one outside of it is the cell wall. So the cell wall is going to help give structure to the cell as well as protect it. Now some prokaryotes also have the capsule. That is an additional protective layer outside the cell. And then there are other sort of appendages on these cells. We'll talk about them in a little bit more detail later. There are these pili that are hair-like projections. They help cells attach to things. They sometimes are involved in DNA transfer. So I said that those plasmids can be transferred between cells. Sometimes pili work in that transfer of DNA. And then we also have here flagellum. So these are sort of a whip-like structure that helps with cellular movement. Now, you guys might be familiar with the flagellum on a sperm. That's what it is. It just sort of flips around and helps move the cell in its environment. All right, so let's move on to eukaryotic cells. So we said that there are four main features of a cell: plasma, membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. Now, eukaryotic cells have all of those things, but they have some additional compartments that allow them to have specific and isolated functions within the cells. Now, many of the functions of eukaryotic cells are also performed in the prokaryotic cells. They're just not isolated into their own structure. So we have some examples of multicellular organisms here. We've got a plant, an animal, a fungus. Those are our major eukaryotic groups. There's a fourth eukaryotic group called the protists, and those are sort of not their own group. They are branches within some of these other groups that all happen to be unicellular or single-celled eukaryotes, so slightly different. So in the roughly 2 billion years that eukaryotes have been on Earth, they've evolved into a wide variety of creatures. Anything from a platypus, the porcupine we have here, dolphins, sequoia, the succulent we have there, and even different kinds of fungi, different kinds of crazy plants. All of those are eukaryotic organisms. So somehow we evolved from, and when I say we, I don't mean specifically humans, although I kind of do. I'm just talking generally, general life forms. Evolved from prokaryotes, and the prokaryotes diversified over time into this huge range of interesting organisms. So the thing that distinguishes a eukaryotic cell from a prokaryotic cell is the presence of a nucleus. So the nucleus is an enclosed structure, a structure that houses the genetic information. It houses the DNA in the cell. So they're the largest the largest organelle, and often the most prominent one in the cell is the nucleus, because we have a huge amount of genetic information contained in each one of our cells. And within the cytoplasm, we have other organelles, and each of those organelles has its own specific function. They can perform their own set of chemical reactions or their own special jobs within the cell, and they do this isolated from other organelles in the cell, and this allows them to be more efficient. Basically, they can do their own job in isolation and not have to worry about the other reactions that are going on around them. Another distinguishing feature of a eukaryotic cell is that there can be up to 10 times bigger than a prokaryotic cell, some even more than that. They're much larger than a eukaryotic cell. So on the right here we have the prokaryotic cell. You can see there's no nucleus. There's not really any defined area where our DNA is kept. DNA is found in the cytoplasm, and it really is sort of found in a region called the nucleoid region, where all the DNA sort of is clustered, but it's not surrounded by a membrane, and that is the key to the nucleus. The internal structures of a prokaryote really are not organized into compartments, and they are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. So this is a basic outline of the animal cell. This is a very cartoonish outline, sort of a generic animal cell. You can see all of those organelles listed on the right-hand side of our screen there. And this is sort of just the general structure. All of those organelles, with the exception of one in this image, are found in both animals and plant cells. And so when I go to plants on the next slide, you'll recognize these similar structures. Now this suggests a similar origin, a similar ancestor. We do have one specific organelle called the centriole in these animal cells that are not found in plant cells, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to go through each one of these organelles in just a little bit and talk about why they're important, what their job is in the cell. And we've got the plant cell. You can see that there are a lot of similar structures, and they do the same job, whether they are in plants or animal cells. One of the big distinguishing characteristics between a plant cell and an animal cell is the presence of a cell wall. Plants have a cell wall. It's a hard, firm structure that gives it a physical shape. Many fungi and many protists also have cell walls. It helps sort of give them structure. Plant cells also have chloroplasts. Those are what make the plant look green. We won't go into too much detail on how they work, but what they do is take sunlight energy and convert it into sugar for the plant. So they're super important. We'll come back to them. And then plant cells also have a vacuole. So a vacuole is sort of a storage facility. We see these occasionally in animals, not nearly as often in plant cells. And that vacuole stores water and sort of gives structure and a water reservoir for those plant cells. So let's talk about where some of these organelles might have come from. So again, we've got another theory here. This theory is the endosymbiosis theory, or the endosymbiont theory. And it's currently sort of the best explanation for the origin of two very important organelles within our cell. Not our cell, in animals and plant cells. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So we have these chloroplasts. I mentioned them briefly in the previous slide. They convert sunlight energy and turn it into sugars. And then we have the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is important because the mitochondria convert energy that comes into the cell into ATP, which is the usable energy source in our cell. So according to this endosymbiosis theory, the chloroplasts and mitochondria were actually different prokaryotes that were sort of taken in and became part of a larger cell. Sorry for that little blip there, some technical difficulties. So the theory of endosymbiosis is supported by several important observations. So the idea behind this theory is that a larger prokaryotic cell engulfed these two organelles, and then they formed a symbiotic relation. This means a mutually beneficial relationship. And they became part of the functioning of this larger prokaryote, and in such a way that the larger prokaryote began to depend on them. And so they sort of evolved within this larger prokaryote. On the next slide, I'll show you an example of how they think that the process through which this occurred. But let's talk about some of the support for this theory. So chloroplasts and mitochondria are similar in size to prokaryotic cells that we see today, and they divide in the same through the same process. This is something called binary fission, and it's essentially that one cell splits into two identical cells. Chloroplasts and mitochondria each have their own ribosomes and their own small amounts of circular DNA. So recall that I talked about prokaryotes having these ribosomes and having small circular bits of DNA. And then if you sequence those pieces of DNA, chloroplast and mitochondrial DNA have DNA sequences that are more similar to bacteria than they are to eukaryote DNA. And so these are some really compelling pieces of evidence for this theory. So here we have an image of how this might have come about. So we have this prokaryotic cell. It says ancestor to eukaryotes because it's going to evolve into a eukaryote that has DNA, it has a membrane, and it is suggested that the cell sort of engulfed it and brought it in, which is one way that cells will take in food. Prokaryotic cells will take in food, and so they engulfed this cell, but it wasn't consumed. And eventually a symbiotic relationship formed where the eukaryotic cell was now dependent on this first organelle. Now, it's proposed that this first organelle was the mitochondria, the one that is so lovingly known as the powerhouse of the cell. It converts energy into usable energy in the cell. And the reason that we think that this happened first was that mitochondria are found in both animal and plant cells. So then some of these guys would have gone on to the animal and fungi lineage. Some of them would have then, or one of them, would have engulfed a precursor to the, over time, this is only showing one part of this, this organelle would have developed into the mitochondria. Now, some of these guys, I got a little ahead of myself, would have gone on to become animals and fungi. Some of them, or one of them, as I began to say, would have then engulfed a chloroplast. And so this is why some of them have chloroplasts, but all of them have mitochondria. The mitochondria was engulfed first, and then some of them engulfed a precursor to the chloroplast, which could convert sunlight energy into usable energy for the cell. So now there's another theory or actually hypothesis, I think is a better word, for how some of the other organelles could have come about. And this is through the process of invagination. So this means that the plasma membrane would have folded in upon itself and sort of become the sort of inner compartments of some of these organelles. So it's thought that some of the organelles came about via endosymbiosis and some of them came about via invagination. It was probably a combination of two, and we'll talk about these organelles here that are basically made up of structures similar to the plasma membrane, which is why they think that these came through invagination.